Before we begin, I wish to inquire whether Bob Moritz is already online. Wonderful. Great to see you. Hi, welcome. Very brief introduction for this absolutely, in my opinion, critical panel on initiating systemic change for people and planet. I think we all agree that we as a community of nations are failing to address our big global problems, whether it is climate change and biodiversity loss, financial instabilities, cyber threats, a variety of other issues. And one important reason why that is the case is that, as we've already discussed this morning, economic prosperity does not automatically guarantee the prosperity of society and the environment. And what this panel is meant to do is to point the way forward. Where do we go from here in the light of this insight? And there are several pathways that need to be followed in this regard. One is we need a wider understanding of human flourishing, of human well-being, than simply the economic. The social and the environmental needs to be part of it as well. Secondly, we need to have collaboration across different stakeholders, between countries, but also between business and policymakers and civil society. And this needs to be a true spirit of collaboration. This is not just enlightened self-interest, but we act in the wider public interest. And how such collaboration can be induced, what the conditions are to bring it about, will be absolutely critical. And lastly, we need a better understanding of the implications of our ignorance. Usually we deny our ignorance by assuming that the world, if it's imperfectly known, is probabilistic, and we do not have sufficient regard for things that we really do not know, and therefore we cannot have a good basis for understanding what the appropriate trade-off is between experimentation, just seeing what works, and the precautionary principle on the other side. So we need a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about how the economy works in interaction with society and the environment. So let me turn to this exciting group of panelists and begin with you, Bob. We've heard a considerable amount about the challenges that we face. Can you give us examples of progress that is being made, which can help be a signpost for the future, as well as reflect on the obstacles we face and on how we can really drive forward progress? And what I would suggest for all of us is to restrict your answer to around 3 minutes so that we can have several rounds of conversation and make it truly interactive. Bob.
Dennis, thanks very much for the question, and I apologize for not being there with you, as I thoroughly have enjoyed attending the GSS events of the past. Your question is a good one, and let me point to one specific example and bring it back to your opening comments. If you think about the Inflationary Reduction Act in the United States, it was a significant political achievement that brought together societal needs, economic demands and expectations, and political will to actually make systemic change. across the country. The idea was very much to align around the focus areas in the aspects of climate, but at the same time, go to the economic investment and equally as important, the economic returns that the country, its communities, and its citizens would actually benefit from. Now, the Inflationary Reduction Act, many of us know what's happening from the bigger issue perspective in terms of the opportunity that sits there and the amount of money that has been provided by the system that's been put in place. But let me take it down to a much more micro level. My particular alumni school, the college I went to, resides in a very small space in upstate New York. It's one that is not economically flourishing. What is interesting is that entire university system, of which there's probably 6,000 students that go there, has pivoted to the implications and the benefits that will come from the Inflationary Reduction Act. And what do I mean by that? First, there's plants being built that have benefited from the Inflation Reduction Act within a 200-kilometer radius of that school, because the incentives have been put in place and the communities have taken advantage of it, and the business and the organizations in particular sectors have seen the opportunities. The school, as a result, has actually changed its curriculum to skill people differently to be better fit for and aligned with the needs of society going forward with climate skills, green skills in mind, to prepare them better for future economic deployment. And I read this example as one where government has worked together with business to create an opportunity. And yes, there's a cost with it, but the economic and societal returns in terms of better for the planet, better for economics, and better for the citizens and society are actually starting to come to fruition. It's the power of the end statement. Let's go to the other macro power in the world. In China, you see exactly the same thing happening in a different way. Again, we can understand, each of us in the room, the difference between the US and China, but in China, the government has now finally woken up to the need to make significant change, and they are pulling all levers of regulation change and other aspects to look at both supply and demand as we think about energy consumption. You see on the demand side, the implication relevant to the cars that are being created now, where they own 40% of the market share relevant to EVs. On the other side, you're seeing consumption being better educated and the citizens having higher degrees of expectations of what to do. Both systems have challenges. I admit that. I don't want to debate that here today. But in both cases, in both superpowers, we're starting to see the alignment and the activation comes, which to me, Dennis, back to your question, gives us a signpost or a beacon for hope as we look at the systemic aspect and the benefits that may be coming from this.
Thanks very much, Bob. That's really important. The alignment of economic returns with what is good for society and good for nature. Now, Ingrid, I'd like to turn to you because you've seen firsthand that how difficult it is under very challenging circumstances to bring this alignment about. And how do you see in your work movement that can achieve both the pace and the scale that we require to address urgent problems like climate change and biodiversity loss?
Yeah, thank you. Dennis, I think when you look back, actually, when we departed with the Global Solution Initiative to work on models like decoupling economic growth from resource exploitation, circular economy, and so far, it was more or less perceived as a debate that was coming from Europe, from the global north, with little traction actually in poorer countries or the global south. What has changed since a couple of months, I see a vibrant debate, especially in our partner countries, exactly in what kind of economic model can work for people and planet likewise. Because we see globally that we see the severe impact of climate change and biodiversity loss. It destroys livelihoods of many, many people. And I think we all become more cognizant that we only can deal with those issues together. There has to be a trustful relationship. We have to create more space for solidarity, quite frankly. And we have to put the right framework condition in place, really, to make the financial flows actually accessible for those that are most in need, which is not the case right now. So what I see is that actually on the ground, when we work with Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, India, that there is a huge appetite really to embark on a very deep and systemic transformation of the societies and their economies. In Africa, many countries see the opportunities that are embedded really in a greener and fossil-free economy. But of course, they see what are also the risks. Does this pay off for my young society? Do we create sufficient jobs? And how can I attract the private sector really to do the part that they have to play? And I think here I see that we have to invest much more in this type of trusted relationships, international cooperation. When you look at the figures that are available, you really see that we are somehow diminishing our contributions as ODA to the Global South. Well, of course, this is not all what we need. We have to mobilize trillions of US dollars, but there's also some kind of risk involved. And unless we, at the international level, are willing really to invest more in this type of cooperation, I think it will be very difficult for many partner countries that would like to scale up and embark on a bigger transformation at a bigger pace, that they can really do it, especially when it comes to the just part. Getting out of coal in South Africa, this is not only an issue for coal mining region, where we can do reskilling, upskilling for those miners that are going to lose their jobs. But it's really about transformation also of the whole region, of the whole society. So unless we get the right fiscal policies in place, we get the right social protection schemes to be more resilient vis-à-vis economic shocks, I think this transformation that is required really to hit 1.5 degree target, this is not doable for many, many countries. And finally, Dennis, we often speak about the global financial flows, absolutely core and center, but let's be cognizant also about the fact that half of the investment that is being needed in order to make our future fossil-free and greener will have to come from domestic resources, from the private sector, tax schemes. There is another issue that we have to address, because when you look into the figures that are being published by the IMF and the World Bank and other think tanks, too much money is leaving the Global South to find a more safer investment opportunity. And this is an issue. So, of course, we have to mobilize global solidarity for the global commons, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we generate framework conditions in those partner countries that are conducive for the type of change that we need.
Thank you very much. That's really sobering. And Isabella, you're taking notes, and I'm sure that everyone and everybody here is thinking, oh my goodness, that sounds like quite a mouthful. And you are in part in the driver's seat. It's Brazil's G20 presidency, and it's Brazil's opportunity to help drive the global agenda in this regard. We heard Bob talking about the need to drive things along at the appropriate speed and also at the appropriate scale. Both IRA and the Chinese electric vehicles are really good examples of that. How is Brazil rising to this challenge of pace and scale with regard to the central priorities that it has set itself in the G20?
Okay, we have one day discussion now, no? Probably my time to explain this. 2 minutes, it's fantastic, no? Let me see how we in Brazil, we're approaching the process that we have the next 2 years. It's not only G20. Okay, and if you go into G20, you need to observe that the last 5 years, you have the G20, you have the developing countries chairing G20. Until next year, we have South Africa. So if you come to discuss what are the balance after 5 years, cycle 5 years under the domain, the political domain of emerging economies, we need to understand what's happening in the world. Okay, so my first point here is that when we come to discuss this new systemic change, we are discussing the future. But you need to bring the future to the present, because if you repeat what we did last century, that we imagine climate change happening at the end of this century, this is not true. So we need to understand, to discuss the future means to discuss what choice be taken now and how this will impact the future. And my feeling when we have this presence of G20, this is wicked and the complex problems to come in a debate that have a like-minded blocks, the most important economies in the world, that are not able to answer a simple question: when we stop to buy fossil fuels? It's not to produce, it's to buy. If you go to run 1.5 Celsius degrees troika, it's not who is producing, who is buying this. And even in the United States, IRA is not able to say with transparency, I will stop buying fossil fuels by 2040 or 2050. This is, if you want to discuss transparency, if you want to rebuild trust, we need to ground things and to make sure how we can share things and to influence things to change. So Brazil is a country that has an energy mix based on, our electric mix is 90% based on renewable. So it is not our problem. Yes, it's our problem because we need to avoid setbacks in the future. And for this, we need to improve our performance on renewable and share technologies. But when we go into this debate, based on our renewable source, part of this is biofuels, and we have restrictions, new restrictions. Now the guys are adding new restrictions to avoid biofuels to be so competitive. We are a huge country. There is no dispute between food production and renewable energy production in my country. We have zoning, we have rules, etc. But another country that demands this are asking to join us, developing economies, emerging economies, even in China. It's a huge partnership, bilateral partnership between Brazil and China concerning biofuels. And how this will come in the future, if you want to address concrete solutions, and why this is important. Because back to your question, Dennis, about G20. We have been discussing in G20, and you know this, and also in BRICS Plus next year, Brazil chair, and you have other block-minded arrangement, like-minded arrangement blocks, that this is outside the climate regimes. This is outside on FCCC regime. So you have a debate outside of this. This is no legally binding. And you go into an FCCC multilateral system and you have another debate. This is the trick situation that we have today in Brazil, how we merge the presidents of G20, the outcomes of G20, that's not a legal obligation, together with COP30 process, and make sure that you can have really some solutions that could be provided in the next 5 years or 10 years if you go to the next 10 years of Paris Agreement. So this is really complex, my last comment, because even you have an agreement based on last century or in Paris Agreement that I heard the Brazilian had delegation, the geopolitical conditions that embrace us, they are over. You have a fragmented world, as you know, and you need to convince individually, regionally, and based on bilateral cooperation, for example, Brazil and Germany, how we should come together to avoid new dependence, new political and economic dependence, considering the solution that will emerge. And this was not the global south on global north. I don't like this for climate. I prefer West and non-Western countries because we share values. It is my last comment. You need values to be shared if you want to agree in common and share solutions to make the difference. If not, I'm so sorry, it's still going to postpone. And as I mentioned before, probably nature will be back against us.
I think
to provoke
this
you, my dear
is...
friend.
No, this is a really important point, and that is when we seek a fundamental change, then it will be some combination of internal mechanisms like norms and values, and external mechanisms that set boundaries on what we do. And we are here to discuss what the nature of those two things are, and particularly the boundaries, because the internal mechanisms are things that often follow the boundaries. Now, Mark, in your varied career as diplomat and president of the Open Society Foundations, you have grappled with this from a completely different perspective. And I'd like to return to Bob's original comment about the need that there is hope, but we need pace and scale. And particularly in the context of open societies, how can you get open society, how can you induce societies to be open, and at the same time get them to cooperate, collaborate across national social boundaries to achieve that pace and scale? What could you say in terms of concrete options that we should be taking forward?
Well, not to add to the gloom, but you know, open societies would be a rather modest platform for global cooperation in today's world, because half the world isn't open, and there has been an 18-year democratic retreat around the world. So we need an international system that works in a way to find shared values and shared collaboration across very different political as well as economic systems. And that's difficult when it comes also to finding, as I say, that values point. But at the moment, and forgive me if I do go to the international system, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, because so much of our hope in finding solutions ultimately vests in them. You know, these are institutions which at their moment of birth were closer to the death, the assassination of Lincoln, the fall of the Meiji Empire in Japan, to the extension of the male franchise in the UK for the first significant time. They're closer to those events than they are to today. Now, why do I make that point? Because that was a period in world history when, you know, the leaders on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere were more used to people being organized through systems of economic coercion, slavery in the case of the US and Lincoln's death associated with that, colonialism in the case of much of the world, and in the case of some of the remaining empires, serfdom. And so, you know, we've now moved into a world of free people, and yet we have institutions, at least in whose historic beginnings, the systems that they had been exposed to were far from that. And it's not just how workers were organized, it was how the relations between states were organized, with only 48 members at the beginning of the UN, with large parts of the world still under colonial control. So there is a dramatic relaunch of these institutions and their purposes, which is needed, but it occurs at a moment of massive geopolitical disruption and contest and conflict, where there's no likelihood of a kind of San Francisco moment or a Bretton Woods moment where you go and reboot these institutions from scratch. We must work within them, but to bring them from that sort of mid-20th century moment to a future into the 21st century. And I think in that way, you know, this is what makes meetings like yours then so important, because, you know, you're in a sense raising people's consciousness and ambition about huge global problems, and at the moment only institutions which are able to work at an incremental level to solve them.
I think in this Global Solutions Summit, we would like to go one step, a significant step, beyond increasing awareness, which is actually getting down to work and thinking about solutions. And I think the challenge that has been put on the table by you, Isabella, saying we need values, and you, Mark, saying, well, these values are in conflict and we can no longer rely on global coercion to pull in the right way. That leads me to you, Bob, because you, at the apex of a large international organization that spans most of the countries of the world, are used to dealing with very different cultures, norms, and values, and are used to thinking across these different perspectives, and nevertheless helping all your partners move in a direction that has some coherence. Now, my question to you is, can we galvanize some of the insights that you have gleaned from this rich reservoir of experiences to understand better what we should be doing now at a broader scale, not just within business, but between business, society, polity as a whole. And therefore, more specifically, and in this second round, I'm really going to try to be very specific. What specifically do you think business would need from government in order to play what is potentially its greatest and most important driving role that it could be playing in this collaborative challenge?
Dennis, if I can come back to a couple of themes that have been mentioned already. At the start, we talked about, even though we have progress, we're not moving at the scale and the pace that's needed. You don't have that sense of urgency. And if you look back to history, the most recent time where we needed that scale, that pace, and that sense of urgency was when the world went through COVID. There were three things that were fundamentally different back then, even as Mark described, different systems around the world with a different sense of underlying internal values. You had a huge societal threat that everybody understood. You had a willingness for collaboration, and this, to your point and your question, a willingness for government and business to work together to change the rules of the game, to radically change potentially the speed and pace of the outcomes. What do I mean by that? Historically, you had rules in countries and across countries around the time it was needed to develop vaccines. In some countries, that was 10 years of testing. We didn't have 10 years to deal with it. We changed the rules, we figured out a way to collaborate, and we actually got it done in an unbelievable amount of time. It was a great presentation of humanity coming together and willing to change the rules to get to the outcome that benefited humanity. We don't have that now. And that's what we now need to get to. So to your question specifically, we can continue to have the general conversations at a UN, at a Bretton Woods, and others, and try to get those internal values aligned. But the reality is we have a series of different systems around the world. So the better thing now to do is say within those systems, what are the rule changes that are needed to be made by government, to be applied by business, to get the scale and the cohesiveness at a pace of change that's needed. Some of them are, in fact, the boundaries of the rules of engagement around the use of and the benefits of the planet. We have them on financial systems. We need them about societal resources. I made that point last year when I spoke to this same group. I'm going to come back now to Isabella's point. As you think about energy, consumption, climate. Let's go back to COP28. What was said was we agreed on three general principles: phasing out fossil fuels, tripling up renewables, and doubling the amount of efficiency from whatever energy source was given, fossil fuels or renewables, but double the efficiency to deal with the fact that over the next 2 to 3 decades, we're going to have a 25% increase in the amount of people on this planet, never mind the rise of the middle class, which will continue to increase consumption. So now what is needed is the G20 group and all of the prep necessary between the B20, the T20, and everything else predecessing that has to be on a journey collectively together. The G7 meetings, the WEF meetings, the GSS meetings, the COP meetings, to say what is it that we are going to do to drive that change at the necessary pace. And yes, what are the business rules that need to change, and what are the government policies that have to actually drive that with a fresh sheet of paper? Not bolting on an incrementalism, but a fresh sheet of paper to radically disrupt ourselves. And that radical disruption is where we need those engaged in business to drive that change and interact with governments to make it come to life. That's I think the need right now that we're not having. We're dealing with too much incrementalism, too much siloism, and too many fractured organizations operating in their own silos. And unless we can get the collective major initiatives and meetings aligned around the need for radical disruption and rule changes, I'm afraid we're not going to make the changes necessary to get to the pace and scale that we need.
Thanks so much. And exactly, and that does deserve a much bigger round of applause. I believe that was one of the major reasons why when we met ages ago in Davos, decided to put global solutions together. Because we are not yet another voice competing for others. We generate ideas that are meant to provide a cohesive platform that can take things forward. And we've had a reasonable amount of success. Right in year one, we played an important role in pandemic preparedness 3 years before it became an issue, starting global cooperations. And we need to do the same, but with the new sense of urgency, a COVID sense of urgency, to drive forward our other challenges. Now, with regard to, and just within 2 minutes, Isabella, what concretely is the Brazilian presidency doing, Isabella?
Yes, me.
That's you. There are no others around this table. What exactly is the Brazilian presidency doing or is planning to do in order concretely to provide guidelines for business, society, in order to drive us forward towards this global collaboration that Bob was talking about?
G20 or COP30?
Take the G20 because that is where you've got...
Okay, I think that there is two issues that absolutely, they are critical issues that must be addressed, and the Brazil president is provoking this. The first one, you go into the finance world, and you know that G20 have 2 tracks, okay, the finance tracks and the Sherpa tracks. Sherpa tracks is the rest of the world, and this is finance, the part of the world, the key world. So Brazil proposed a task force that to discuss climate finance into finance Sherpa and finance track, okay? And this is how Brazil president is trying to merge things, because you're not discussing only climate finance. Indeed, we're discussing development finance. This means that we're looking forward to have a new economy model, global economy models, we transform development, et cetera, et cetera. So the complexity of the debate is so huge, but this is one important step that we adopt to be disruptive in the process.
Could I just say, this is really important, because in policy work, you have ministries galore saying, we need this, we need that, and then the finance ministers say, okay, well, there's going to be no money for it, and that's the end. So to merge things becomes really important.
And the debate is not easy. My second point very quickly is that have last year the regional cooperation agreement meeting of the head of state in Amazon region. Brazil proposed that the heads of the countries, head of state, sign a letter, Belém letter, that will recognize Amazonia as the tipping point in Amazon forest. This means planetary boundaries. It's the first time, okay, that heads of state recognize this. Globally, you don't have this. Okay, you don't have this globally, but you have this in regional perspectives. So how we can move the pieces, okay, to make sure that this is a solution that will make the difference in the future. Nobody indeed understands this very well yet, but Brazil took the decision to manage the pieces in an innovative direction. This is there, signed, and nobody's discussed this yet.
Now, I think that's really important, awareness, but I'd now like to turn to you, Mark. We know that awareness alone and voluntary contributions will not lead to anything, will not lead to anything sufficient. What do you think needs to be done in this world without massive coercion in order to get different countries to align, but in a non-voluntary way, to bind themselves to principles that will serve everyone if everyone participates? I think this is a critical time to pose this question, because if we ask ourselves, are we going to take a break from addressing climate change because there's a war in the Ukraine, etc., then the next generation will never forgive us. How do you see us coming together as a community of nations?
I think it does require, I think Brazil's leadership of the G20 and the COP is an example of new energetic leadership from new quarters, if you like. I think Mia Mottley, who leads one of the smallest islands out there, a lump of rock called Barbados in the ocean, has proven much more powerful in her championing of international collaboration on climate mitigation and adaptation than the leaders of the United States or China. So, there is space for dynamic leadership. And, there are certainly leaders here in Europe who've also risen to the occasion. But I think they're going to rise to it around a new model of, if you like, voluntary multilateralism, or mini-lateralism as some call it, where countries come together around a common enforceable framework on something like climate. The countries that choose to stay out pay the costs of staying out. They find themselves disadvantaged because their goods are too carbon dependent, they get tariff charged, etc. So ultimately they probably come in. But the idea of a multilateralism dependent on the last mover, on not being able to do everything until everybody agrees, is, I think, in a divided world like this, not practical. So I think we need dynamic minilateralism around critical issues. And I would just say to Bob, the IRA would have been even better if it had been a product of minilateralism rather than US nationalism. It didn't have a single penny in it for international climate work, and has led to a massive reflow of funds to the US from developing countries because of the subsidy of reindustrialization in America. I love the green aspects of the IRA. I love what it's done for its campus in upstate New York, but I abhor what it's done for large parts of the world, and how much better it would have been if it had been a collaborative system of building a trade bloc which shared green values and green goals.
Great, that's a really important point. And Ingrid, you have the last word. The issue is, how can we bring together best practices and enforce a level playing field so that the vanguard can help move the rest of the world in the appropriate direction? What, in your experience, can give us hope that we will desperately need in order to achieve precisely this?
Well, first, what gives me a lot of hope is really this exciting leadership that Mark just mentioned. Brazilian presidency, Mia Mottley, who really makes a big plea for more solidarity and fairness globally. So I think we should take those statements really seriously. So for instance, when it comes to financial flows, nowadays actually what we finance in climate protection, it comes from national decision making of parliaments that are being elected for 4 or 5 years. Is this really commensurate with the challenge that we are facing? So Brazil has put on the table taxation for the rich, which would provide an income flow over a decade, over 2 decades. I think what Bob was alluding to, I think we are now at a state where we have to be more open-minded generally with respect to new bold ideas when it comes to debt forgiveness, when it comes to new financial instruments. And what we can do, for instance, as GIZ, is actually that we can bring together those countries that have embarked on the transformation. They can sit together, we provide a platform so that they can share experiences and knowledge. I think this is going to give them hope that it works and give them more expertise how they can actually change course. And this is needed. We have to make sure that the countries that have embarked on the transformation, that they continue to implement it, because there is no time to be lost. And this hope and this trust we can actually fuel through respective platforms such as the Global Solution Summit, but there are many more initiatives like the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, who's going to also provide a space where we can exchange information and experiences on the transformation.
Thanks very much. I think this has provided some groundwork, and I would now like to give all of you in the audience some homework to do, which is that we, since we have reached the stage where we really want to get down to business, collect solutions that may be appropriate for some countries but not for others, but nevertheless guide us in a direction that is in the global public interest. We would like to collect these solutions. From them, we wish to produce white papers that we submit to the relevant G20 national governments in order to get this idea of having different pathways to a common goal through non-voluntary mechanisms be put into practice. And this is a collective effort. This is a collection of at least 70 countries that we've got in this auditorium, not counting all those online. Let's bring this together and help us cooperate with other institutions to make this happen. So thank you very much, Ingrid, Isabella, Bob, Mark. Very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.